cold March rain slicked the cobbled lanes of Milburn village, pooling in the cracks between uneven stones and dripping steadily from the awnings of shops long since closed for the evening. The hour was just past 10, and the church bell had tolled with a hollow finality when the cry went up from the Ellington house at the edge of the green. By the time neighbours gathered, shawls clutched about their shoulders, and the local constable came puffing down the lane, the scandal had already taken root. Madame Ellington's companion had been found lifeless in the great drawing-room, though no one could say how death had reached her, nor why. Madame Ellington herself was a woman of advanced years, once grand, now eccentric, and known throughout the county for her talk of séances and spiritual communications with her late husband. Her house was a curiosity, overstuffed with heavy furniture and veiled lamps, and always faintly scented with lavender and dust. She insisted, with dramatic fervour, that she communed with her husband nightly, and kept vigil in her widow's weeds, as though the man had only just passed. The sudden death of her companion, Miss Clara Whitchurch, therefore struck the village with a peculiar chill. Clara was discovered seated in the high-backed armchair nearest the fire, a teacup resting upright on the little table at her elbow. At first glance she might have seemed merely asleep, her hands folded in her lap, her posture prim, but the bluish tinge about her lips and the glassy stare gave her away. Madame Ellington herself claimed to have been upstairs in her private chambers when she heard the teacup shatter. Yet the cup on the table was whole. Here was the first of the oddities. A maid, pale and trembling, swore she had heard porcelain break. She had run in expecting a mess, only to find the cup intact and Clara beyond help. The windows were locked from within, the door had been closed but not bolted, and no one claimed to have passed along the narrow corridor that led to the drawing-room. The only sound, the maid insisted, had been that impossible shattering, as though someone had meant to draw her in at the precise moment of Clara's death. Constable Harper, a solid man but more used to keeping boys from scrumping apples than unravelling mysteries, scratched his head and declared it must have been natural causes. Clara was not young after all, and fainting fits were whispered of. Yet Dr. Trevors, who examined her, frowned deeply. He could find no wound, no bruise, no sign of struggle, but equally no reason her heart should have failed so suddenly. Poison was suspected, though none was detected in the faint remains of tea in the cup. The second oddity was the scrap of paper, found half-tucked beneath the cushion of Clara's chair. It bore only a few words, written in a hurried, unsteady hand. "The widow keeps what she should not." This cryptic note was all the more troubling because Clara herself had no known enemies, and had been considered dutiful, quiet, and almost overly devoted to Madame Ellington. By the following morning, the matter had already spread through Milburn like fire in dry brush. At the bakery, at the post office, even at the vicar's, tongues wagged ceaselessly. What secret did Madame Ellington's widowhood conceal? Why had Clara, meek and dutiful, been silenced? Some suggested a burglar had come by stealth, though what thief leaves no sign of entry nor carries away a thing? Others muttered darkly of spirits, of the late Mr. Ellington himself returning from beyond to silence Clara for meddling in matters that ought not to be disturbed. It was under these circumstances that Miss Jane Marple, in her neat grey hat and with her quiet knitting bag under her arm, happened to arrive in Milburn. She had come, as she often did, to visit a distant cousin nearby, and as she alighted from the omnibus she caught the low murmur of gossip before she even reached her lodgings. A mystery, she thought, had a way of making itself known to her, as though it sought her out. And though she was unassuming in her manners, she listened with keen attention when the housemaid at her cousin's table repeated the story of the unbroken teacup and the widow's strange habits. The atmosphere at the Ellington house was tense when Miss Marple called the next afternoon. The heavy drapes were drawn, lending the place a solemn gloom, and Madame Ellington herself reclined upon a sofa, a shawl drawn dramatically about her shoulders. She received visitors with an air of resigned tragedy, insisting the whole affair was an act of fate, inexplicable to mortal minds. Yet Miss Marple noticed, as she settled herself politely into a corner, that the fire was freshly laid though it had not been lit, that the curtains bore faint tracks of recent handling, and that the maid who admitted her seemed unusually nervous, as though glancing constantly at her mistress for approval. She asked no direct questions. Instead, she listened. Madame Ellington spoke of Clara's loyalty, her sudden passing, and the cruelty of the whispers in the village. Her voice quavered with the tremors of age, but her eyes, sharp and glittering, did not match her words of helpless grief. When Madame excused herself for a moment, Miss Marple's gaze lingered on the teacup, which had been carefully polished and returned to its place upon the sideboard. It was delicate porcelain, thin as eggshell, the sort that does not endure rough handling. She tapped the rim gently with her fingernail and listened to the high, chiming note. The sound was clean, unbroken, but it brought to mind, quite vividly, the maid's testimony of hearing a cup shatter at the precise moment of death. A sound that had led her to the room, a sound that had not come from the object in front of her. On the table lay a book of psalms, as though meant for comfort, yet tucked within was a pressed violet and a pencilled margin note in Clara's neat hand. Miss Marple, with her unerring memory for character, recalled Clara as a woman who rarely wrote anything at all, being modest and reserved. That she had left even a few words was remarkable, words that seemed to suggest disapproval. The puzzle pieces did not yet fit, but they were intriguing. The note beneath the cushion, the sound of shattering that had not been real, the absence of poison, the secretive eyes of the widow herself. These were not the marks of happenstance, nor of a wandering burglar. They pointed to something within the house itself, something carefully hidden and closely guarded. That evening, as the rain began again, and the gas lamps flickered in the misty lanes, Miss Marple sat quietly by her cousin's hearth, knitting set aside and considered the matter with her characteristic blend of patience and clarity. An unsolvable crime, some would call it. Yet she had always found that in human affairs, even the most baffling occurrences had their roots in the ordinary motives of fear, greed, jealousy, or love. Somewhere among the teacups and curtains of Madame Ellington's grand old house, she was certain, lay the very human reason why Clara Whitchurch had been silenced forever. The following morning dawned pale and wet, the rain having softened into a drifting mist that clung to the hedgerows and blurred the edges of the village green. Constable Harper, practical to the bone though clearly overwhelmed, made his second visit to the Ellington house, accompanied by Dr. Trevors and the coroner. The business was official now, though the proceedings struck most onlookers as perfunctory. Clara Whitchurch's body had been removed in the night, and her cause of death remained uncertain, though Harper insisted to any who asked that it was a matter for experts, and no one in Milburn need trouble themselves further. Yet the whispers did not stop. They never did in a place so small. Miss Marple, having risen early and set her knitting aside with a decisive air, walked toward the house as though simply on her morning errand. She knew enough of human nature to realize that sometimes, to understand a mystery, one must place oneself in its very centre and watch how the actors moved about it. She was received with reluctant civility. The housemaid, still pale, her apron rumpled, hesitated before admitting her. Inside, the drawing-room had been stripped of the obvious traces of last night's tragedy. The armchair where Clara had sat was turned toward the wall, as if its very sight were offensive, and the rug had been shifted slightly to cover what Miss Marple suspected were faint marks of spilt tea. Madame Ellington reclined as before, swathed in shawls and pale lace, though her posture was more rigid now. Her words of grief, though fluent, carried less spontaneity, as though she repeated them to preserve an image. Miss Marple's eyes, though kindly, missed nothing. On the mantelpiece stood a clock of ornate brass, its pendulum swinging with faint irregularity. She noted the time with care. On the table near the sofa lay a half-completed letter, its ink blotched, and beside it a pen placed oddly askew. Most curious of all was the small glass dome in the corner cabinet, beneath which lay shards of porcelain. The fragments belonged to a teacup, delicately painted with violets, its handle snapped clean. Miss Marple observed it with the faintest arch of her brow. "A little accident," Madame Ellington murmured when she noticed Miss Marple's attention. "One of my late husband's cherished possessions. I could not bear to part with the pieces." Her tone was light, but the maid's hands, which gripped the tea-tray a shade too tightly, suggested that the breaking had been recent and perhaps connected to more than sentiment. Miss Marple asked no direct question, merely thanked the woman for her hospitality and spoke gently of Clara's virtues. She watched Madame Ellington's eyes carefully when Clara's name was mentioned. There was a flicker, resentment rather than sorrow, and Miss Marple tucked it away in her memory. Constable Harper entered shortly after, his notebook in hand, his boots still carrying damp from the lane. He greeted Madame Ellington with clumsy solemnity and inquired whether she had recalled any sound or sight that might aid the investigation. Madame insisted she had been upstairs all evening, a claim repeated with rehearsed certainty. It was then that Miss Marple, standing slightly apart, noticed the faintest trail of damp upon the hall runner leading from the kitchen toward the rear of the house. The rain outside was steady, but no one had come through the front since she herself arrived. Whoever had made that trail had passed through earlier, unremarked. The marks were not bold enough to catch Harper's attention, but to Miss Marple's sharp eyes they stood out as surely as ink upon a page. She also noticed something else. A small framed photograph on the side table showed Clara seated beside Madame Ellington at the garden fete of the previous summer. Clara's smile was dutiful, but her hand rested on the arm of her chair in a peculiar way, as though she were clutching something unseen. Miss Marple leaned closer, her needleworker's eyes accustomed to details others missed. The faintest outline of folded paper peeked from Clara's hand in the picture, paper like the note found after her death. Clara, it seemed, had been in the habit of holding her thoughts close, even in moments meant to appear light-hearted. When Madame excused herself once again, citing the strain of grief, Miss Marple lingered in the drawing-room under the pretence of adjusting her gloves. She let her gaze travel to the curtains, which had been hastily tied back. One tie was knotted differently from the other, as though it had been undone and refastened in a hurry. She brushed the fabric lightly and felt, beneath the velvet folds, a stiffness, inconsistent with age alone. Something had been hidden there recently. Whether removed or still present, she could not yet tell. The constable, meanwhile, contented himself with routine. He asked the maid to confirm times, movements, and noises heard. She repeated her story of the shattering porcelain. Harper scribbled dutifully, frowning, and muttered about tricks of the ear, perhaps from wind in the chimney. Miss Marple, with her quiet voice, asked whether the sound had been sharp or dull, close or distant. The maid hesitated, uncertain, then confessed it had seemed startlingly near, as though in the very room, but when she entered the only cup in sight had been untouched. The significance of that detail deepened Miss Marple's conviction. Someone had meant the maid to come. Someone had lured her at the precise moment of Clara's death, knowing the sound of breaking porcelain would summon attention. But the sound had not been real. Later, as Miss Marple took her leave, she encountered Dr. Trevors at the gate. He was troubled, his spectacles misted from the damp air. "No trace of poison in her stomach," he murmured, "and the heart was sound. I cannot make sense of it, Miss Marple. The body betrays nothing." She offered a mild smile, though her thoughts were far from ease. "There is always something, Doctor," she replied. "One must simply look where others do not." On her walk back through the misty lanes, Miss Marple reflected upon human behaviour, upon how easily people dismiss small irregularities when faced with the dramatic weight of death. But she had learned long ago that guilt leaves marks as visible as footprints on damp earth. Madame Ellington's sharp eyes beneath her theatrics, the maid's nervous glances, the hidden fragments of a broken cup, the irregular knot in the curtain, all spoke of a story behind the official tale. She paused at the edge of the green, listening to the faint clang of the smithy hammer. In her mind she arranged the pieces, the note accusing the widow of keeping what she should not, the stage sound of a cup breaking, and Clara's sudden silence. The beginnings of a pattern emerged, though the full picture was clouded. Someone in that house feared discovery, someone who had taken pains to shape an illusion. And so the game had begun, not of spirits or fate, but of deception. Miss Marple, with her calm patience and unshakable logic, was determined to pull each thread until the truth revealed itself. The mist thickened as the days passed, as though the weather itself conspired to cloak Milburn in secrecy. By the third morning after Clara Whitchurch's death, the Ellington household had grown weary of scrutiny. Constable Harper returned with his notebook, intent on closing the matter as swiftly as possible, but Madame Ellington insisted that she and her servants be heard fully. The vicar had pressed her to show Christian patience. The villagers whispered that silence was dangerous. It was in this atmosphere of half-reluctant cooperation that Miss Marple, gently unobtrusive, found herself present during the constable's questioning. The maid, Elsie, was called first. She wrung her apron in her hands, her eyes darting nervously toward Madame Ellington, who sat nearby with a handkerchief pressed to her lips. Elsie repeated what she had said before, the sound of shattering porcelain, the rush to the drawing-room, the sight of Clara lifeless. But when Harper pressed her about timing, asking exactly how long had passed between the sound and her entrance, her answer wavered. "It couldn't have been more than a few seconds," she stammered. Then, after a pause, "Or perhaps a minute. I couldn't rightly say." Miss Marple tilted her head ever so slightly. The distinction mattered. Had Elsie been drawn instantly by the noise, or had she hesitated, uncertain, before entering? Elsie's shifting eyes suggested more than mere confusion. It was the look of someone rehearsing, afraid to slip. Madame Ellington interrupted then, her voice sharp beneath its mourning veil, to declare that the poor girl was frightened and ought not to be pressed further. Next came Mr. Pritchard, the butler, though in truth his role was nearer to a general manservant. He was a gaunt figure with a pinched expression and a stiffness that seemed to resent being summoned at all. He declared he had been in the cellar fetching firewood, and thus heard nothing of Clara's demise until summoned by Elsie's cry. Yet under gentle questioning from Miss Marple, he admitted that the cellar door gave directly onto the back garden, and that he had stepped outside for air. "A foul damp hangs in that cellar," he explained curtly. "A man needs a breath of the outdoors." Miss Marple asked whether he had noticed anything unusual in the garden at that hour. He hesitated, then shook his head, but too quickly with a firmness that suggested overcompensation. His boots, she observed, carried faint traces of soil not from the damp cellar, but from the softer flower beds. Someone had been where they ought not to. When Madame Ellington herself spoke, her words flowed easily, like lines long practised upon a stage. She claimed she had retired early, suffering from a faintness that often plagued her, and had remained in her chambers until roused by the disturbance. She painted a picture of Clara as devoted, loyal, a constant source of comfort, yet her tone lacked warmth. When Harper asked whether Clara had seemed troubled of late, Madame's denial came swiftly, even sharply, as though the question itself struck too close. Miss Whitchurch was the soul of propriety, she declared. If she wrote notes or muttered concerns, I never knew of them. Miss Marple folded her hands quietly. Madame's words did not align with Clara's note, or with the pencilled remarks in the Psalter. To deny Clara's disquiet so thoroughly was in itself revealing. The gardener, a stooped man named Hodge, was called next. He was reluctant, but his weathered face carried less guile than the others. He admitted seeing Clara in the garden on the day of her death, walking near the hedge where Madame Ellington's late husband had once kept bees. She had been carrying a small parcel, wrapped in cloth. "Looked like she meant to hide it, ma'am," he confessed, glancing uneasily at Madame Ellington. "But when she saw me, she walked back inside quick." His words earned him a sharp glare from his mistress, which he bore with a shrug as though accustomed to it. Finally, Miss Cora Briggs, a neighbour and frequent visitor, offered her account. She was a chatty woman, eager to be useful, and she insisted Clara had confided in her only a fortnight before. "Said she was uneasy, poor dear," Cora prattled, "that she felt she knew too much of things she oughtn't. I thought it nothing at the time, mind you. She was always so quiet. I was glad to hear her speak of anything at all. But now, well, it chills me, it does." Her eagerness was palpable, her relish for being the source of interesting tidings unmistakable. Yet Miss Marple detected something odd. When pressed about what Clara might have meant by knowing too much, Cora grew flustered, her details vague. She could not, or would not, say what those secrets were. Miss Marple marked her as unreliable, but not necessarily malicious. Cora might have embroidered truth to make herself important, a habit not uncommon in village life. When the questioning concluded, Constable Harper looked more bewildered than enlightened. Every witness contradicted another. Elsie claimed she had rushed in immediately, yet her uncertainty betrayed hesitation. Pritchard placed himself in the cellar, but his boots whispered of flower beds. Madame Ellington denied Clara's unease, though others spoke plainly of it. The gardener hinted at hidden parcels, while Cora supplied the flavour of confidences half understood. Miss Marple sat very still through it all, her needles clicking softly as though she were absorbed in her knitting. Yet within her mind, threads wove together. Too many stories overlapped in awkward ways. Someone was lying outright. Others concealed truths out of fear or loyalty. The balance between eagerness and reticence told her much. Elsie was frightened into saying as little as possible. Cora delighted in saying too much, while Madame Ellington and Pritchard both controlled their accounts too tightly, as though rehearsed. When Harper closed his notebook and declared he would report to the proper authorities, Miss Marple smiled gently, as though she were only a bystander. But later, when she walked once more through the damp garden, her eyes caught the faint indentation beneath the yew hedge, half covered by soil. Something had been buried, hurriedly, in recent days. Not a body, no, but perhaps the parcel Clara had carried. She stooped delicately, her fingers brushing the damp earth. It would not do to disturb it yet. Too much prying might alert the guilty. But the contradiction grew clearer. Clara had known something, had hidden something, and someone in the house had feared it enough to silence her. The voices of deception, for all their contradictions, were converging upon the same secret. Miss Marple straightened, her eyes calm but intent. A puzzle of human nature lay before her, and she had learned that the lies people told revealed as much as the truths they concealed. The widow's house hid something it should not keep, and every testimony, false or true, was a thread leading toward it. All she needed was patience, and the truth, she felt, would come to her as inevitably as the dawn that burned away the mist. The rain relented at last, leaving the village washed clean yet heavy with damp earth and sodden hedges. Sunlight pierced fitfully through ragged clouds, and Milburn stirred with renewed gossip. The Ellington affair, as it was now called, had become the single subject of every shop, kitchen, and parish bench. Yet inside the widow's great house the atmosphere remained oppressive, thick with secrets. Miss Marple, ever unobtrusive, had begun her quiet cataloguing of what she had heard, weighing each person's words against the others, and above all against the small but telling details she had observed. It was not enough to know who might have done the deed. Everyone in that house, in one way or another, had reason to wish Clara Whitchurch silent. The question was which motive, when tugged upon, unravelled the whole skein of deception. She began with Elsie, the maid, poor nervous Elsie, wringing her hands as though to dry them of some invisible stain. Elsie's fear was plain, fear of her mistress, fear of saying too much, perhaps even fear of having been nearer to the truth than she dared admit. What motive could Elsie have? Fear of dismissal, perhaps. A maid who stumbled upon her mistress's secrets might be tempted to silence the companion who had threatened to expose them, hoping to protect her own livelihood. Yet Miss Marple's instinct told her Elsie lacked the steel. She might deceive in small matters, but not in so grave a crime. Then there was Mr. Pritchard, the butler. His alibi of fetching firewood rang hollow. Why step out into the garden on a wet night, unless drawn there by necessity? His boots bore soil from the flower beds, not the cellar floor. If Clara had hidden something in the garden, and if Pritchard had found her, their encounter might have led to confrontation. A servant long bound to the Ellington household might resent Clara's influence over the widow, especially if Clara had stumbled upon something best left concealed. His stiff manner suggested pride wounded often, and bitterness harboured long. Yet money also whispered through the halls of that house. Madame Ellington's fortune was not inconsiderable, though diminished from its peak. Clara, it was rumoured, had been written into her will in a modest capacity, a loyal companion provided for, as many wealthy widows arranged. If Clara had discovered something that could imperil Madame's finances, the widow might well see her removal as both practical and necessary. Madame's grief, though voluble, carried the hollowness of performance. Beneath the shawls and lace, her eyes glittered not with sorrow, but with calculation. Jealousy, too, lurked in the shadows. Miss Marple recalled the gardener Hodge's account of Clara in the garden with a parcel. A man like Hodge, simple, bound to earth and toil, might resent the power Clara wielded over the household. Or perhaps he feared she meant to betray some confidence. His gaze had been honest enough. But honesty does not preclude desperate measures, especially when loyalty to a mistress is at stake. And then there was Cora Briggs, the neighbour. Her chatter, eager and unrestrained, concealed a hunger for importance. Clara's half-confidences had given her a taste of significance, and she clung to them greedily. Could jealousy drive her to silence Clara before she revealed her secrets to another? Unlikely, Miss Marple thought, though not impossible. Yet her vagueness about Clara's words suggested she knew more than she dared admit. Perhaps Cora feared what telling the whole truth might mean for herself. The motives wove together in a maze of human weakness: greed for inheritance, revenge for imagined slights, jealousy of influence, fear of exposure, all tangled until no single thread appeared stronger than the rest. But Miss Marple, experienced in the quiet study of her fellow beings, knew that truth is often hidden in the small consistencies, not in the grand displays. She returned in her thoughts to Clara herself. What had Clara feared? What had she known that prompted her to write a note as cryptic as "The widow keeps what she should not"? The words suggested something tangible, not a vague unease, something Madame Ellington possessed, kept against right or law, perhaps even against morality. Clara, dutiful and restrained, would not lightly speak of such matters. To leave a note at all meant she was desperate to record her knowledge, even if she could not say it aloud. The broken porcelain fragments beneath glass in the corner case tugged at Miss Marple's mind. A cup broken, a sound of shattering that never occurred, and a maid summoned to witness Clara's body. Could Clara herself have been attempting to expose the secret in some symbolic fashion? Or had the fragments been substituted as a cover for the stage sound? As she pondered, she walked once more through the garden, ostensibly admiring the damp roses. Near the hedge, she paused. The soil was freshly turned, though clumsily smoothed. She bent with an air of harmless curiosity and noticed the faint outline of a cloth's corner poking through. She resisted the urge to tug it free. Such evidence must be revealed at the proper moment, but the knowledge confirmed her suspicions. Clara had hidden something, and someone else had tried to retrieve or conceal it. Returning to the house, she lingered by the curtains. The irregular knot in the tie-back still troubled her. She loosened it ever so slightly and brushed her hand along the inner seam. The stiffness she felt remained. Something was sewn or tucked within, a hiding place too hastily prepared. Again she left it undisturbed, but her conviction grew. 2 hiding places, one in the garden, one within the room. Clara's secret, and the widow's attempt to contain it. By late afternoon, Miss Marple sat quietly by Madame Ellington's fire, her knitting needles clicking. The widow spoke again of Clara's virtues, yet her tone sharpened whenever Clara's independence was mentioned. Miss Marple asked gently whether Clara had many correspondents. Madame's denial was swift, but her hands fidgeted with the handkerchief. Miss Marple noted the gesture, and with it, the fear that Clara's words might still surface from some unexpected quarter. Every person in the household had something to lose. Elsie feared for her position. Pritchard feared discovery of movements outside the cellar. Hodge feared the consequences of seeing too much. Cora feared her gossip might entangle her, and Madame feared exposure of whatever widow's secret Clara had discovered. Yet only one fear was strong enough to kill, and to kill in so strange a manner, without struggle or mark. Miss Marple rose at last, her knitting folded, her eyes serene. She had not yet the full answer, but she had the shape of it. Clara had stumbled upon something the widow concealed, and in attempting to reveal it she had been silenced. The sound of the shattering cup, the staged lure, the contradictions in testimony, all pointed to a deliberate plan, not chance. The motive maze was intricate, but she had begun to trace its path, and as she stepped out into the damp evening with the last of the sun glinting weakly on the wet stones, she knew that the truth lay not in the supernatural explanations whispered by villagers, nor in the constable's fumbling notes. It lay, as always, in the small, telling cracks in human behaviour. The widow's house kept more than relics of a dead husband. It kept a secret Clara had tried to bring to light, and for that she had paid the ultimate price. Miss Marple, with her quiet certainty, would follow the web until the centre was revealed. By the end of the week, Milburn village buzzed with certainty. Rumour, sharpened by repetition, had already decided the matter long before the constable arrived at his conclusion. The crime, it was said, had been solved. Clara Whitchurch had not been a victim of some mysterious malady nor a ghostly visitation from beyond. She had been poisoned by none other than Mr. Pritchard, the butler. The chain of evidence seemed damning enough, at least to those who longed for resolution. That morning, Constable Harper, red-cheeked with pride, had summoned the widow's household to the drawing-room. Madame Ellington, shrouded in her widow's weeds, and reclining with ostentatious fragility, listened with a mixture of indignation and satisfaction. Indignation at the scandal, satisfaction that the finger pointed away from her. The constable laid out his case in solemn tones. A small vial had been discovered beneath loose boards in the cellar, wrapped in oilcloth. Within was a residue, acrid to smell, unmistakably of some chemical compound. Dr. Trevors, summoned in haste, declared it consistent with a rare but potent poison, one that could induce death swiftly, leaving little trace. The vial, Harper said, bore the faintest smear of soil, as though it had been handled in the garden before being hidden away, and the garden, of course, was precisely where Pritchard had admitted he had gone. Pritchard stood stiff as ever, his jaw set, his eyes glowering beneath a furrowed brow. "I've served this house near 30 years, he growled. "If you think I'd turn to villainy now, you're madder than a hare in spring." But his protests rang hollow against the mounting evidence. The villagers remembered his surly manner, his prideful silences. To them, his guilt seemed obvious, and Harper, eager to resolve a case far beyond his usual apple thieves and quarrelsome drunkards, declared himself satisfied. Elsie the maid wept in a corner, half in relief, half in fear that she herself might once have been suspected. The gardener Hodge muttered about always knowing Pritchard was a bad sort. Even Madame Ellington managed a faint murmur of sorrow, though her eyes glittered strangely with something near a triumph. Yet Miss Marple, sitting quietly with her knitting in her lap, did not share their certainty. She listened carefully to Harper's speech, observed the placement of the vial, noted the eagerness with which the household embraced this conclusion. Something about it unsettled her deeply. The poison, yes, if poison it was, had been found in the cellar. But had it truly been there long? The boards beneath which it was discovered bore fresh marks, as though pried up only recently. Harper had assumed that meant Pritchard had hidden it clumsily, yet to Miss Marple it suggested haste. And if Pritchard truly intended to conceal the vial, why leave it beneath loose boards where it might so easily be found? Surely a man of 30 years' service knew the cellar better than that. She recalled, too, the curious knot in the curtain tie, the stiffness within the folds. Why conceal something there if the cellar already held the incriminating vial? Unless, of course, the curtain hid not the weapon, but something else Clara had sought to protect. When the constable pronounced Pritchard under arrest, Madame Ellington released a tremulous sigh, pressing her lace handkerchief to her lips. "It is dreadful, dreadful beyond words," she intoned. Though no. True grief touched her expression. Miss Marple's eyes, calm and penetrating, lingered on her for a moment. Here was a woman who performed emotion with precision, yet betrayed herself in the smallest flickers of satisfaction. Pritchard, for his part, submitted stiffly to Harper's authority. He did not fight, though his face was thunderous. "I've been made a scapegoat," he muttered as they led him out, "but the truth will come clear, mark my words." In the village, the news spread like wildfire. By evening, the baker's wife repeated with certainty that the butler had confessed, though no such thing had occurred. The vicar spoke gravely of temptation and sin, while others debated how long Pritchard would be sent away. For most, the case was closed, but not for Miss Marple. That night, in her cousin's parlour, she set aside her knitting and considered the facts anew. Clara had written her note about the widow keeping what she should not. Clara had hidden something in the garden, something worth silencing her for. The sound of breaking porcelain had been staged to draw witnesses at the exact moment of her death. Could a surly butler, embittered though he might be, conceive of such a scheme? Miss Marple doubted it. Poison in the tea, perhaps. But the manipulation of sound, the careful luring of the maid, the precise orchestration that spoke of someone with theatrical sensibilities, someone accustomed to staging her life as though it were a drama to be watched. Miss Marple's gaze sharpened. Madame Ellington. But suspicion was not proof, and proof could not yet be drawn into the light. The widow had, with masterly cunning, let suspicion settle elsewhere. The vial in the cellar, so conveniently found, could have been planted, and who had better access to every part of the house than the mistress herself? Who commanded obedience from her servants, who might demand their silence, their complicity, or their lies? The false victory weighed heavily upon Miss Marple. To most eyes the mystery was solved. The authorities congratulated themselves, the villagers calmed, and Madame Ellington returned to her widow's theatrics with renewed vigour. Yet the true criminal remained in the shadows, her secret intact, her danger not yet past. Miss Marple understood the peril. When murderers see their ruse succeed, they grow bold. They believe themselves safe, and in that safety they sometimes strike again. Clara Whitchurch had been silenced for uncovering a secret, but if the secret still lingered, buried in the garden, tucked in the curtain folds, then whoever reached for it next might meet the same fate. And so Miss Marple resolved to tread carefully, to observe every flicker of expression, every nervous glance. The false victory had set the stage for the real contest. The widow's secret remained buried, but not forever. Miss Marple would see to that. Miss Marple spent the morning in quiet reflection, walking along the village lanes, under a sky heavy with the scent of rain-soaked earth. While the village slept in its complacency over Pritchard's supposed guilt, she felt the thread of unease tug at her mind. Something remained overlooked, a detail so subtle that even the smallest hint could illuminate the tangled web of events. She recalled, with a sudden sharpness, the pressed violet found in the Psalter and the small folded parcel that Hodge had seen Clara carrying in the garden. Objects, small and seemingly innocuous, often carried stories older than the day itself. Back at her cousin's parlour, she spread her observations across the table, treating them almost as a map: the broken porcelain, the stage noise, the soil in Pritchard's boots, Madame Ellington's practised grief, and the parcel Clara had hidden. Then her mind drifted further, reaching into memory, not her own, but the accumulated stories of Milburn. It was often the case that mischief and malice had roots in the past, sometimes long buried, but never entirely dead. Her thoughts returned to Madame Ellington. She had been young, vibrant and commanding once before her husband's death, and there had been whispers in the village of a scandal long since buried, a tale of betrayal, of financial duplicity, and a minor theft at a time when Madame had managed her husband's affairs. The memory of these events had faded from the villagers' consciousness, dismissed as mere gossip. But Miss Marple, who remembered far more than most people supposed, had always believed that old wounds, unhealed, often drove present actions. It was a visit from Cora Briggs later that afternoon that supplied the first concrete connection. Cora, ostensibly concerned, had come to speak further of Clara, but Miss Marple noticed something in the neighbour's manner, a hesitance whenever the widow's name was mentioned, a flicker of recognition, almost of fear. I only wish to be helpful, Miss Marple," Cora said, but her eyes told another story. "It's just that, well, there are old things, past grievances, things best left alone." The words sparked a recollection in Miss Marple. Years ago, Madame Ellington had been embroiled in a dispute with a distant cousin over inheritance and property. The cousin had vanished from the household, leaving a minor scandal unresolved. Certain servants and neighbours had known details, but the case had faded into memory, with only hints of resentment lingering like shadows. Could it be that Clara, in her role as companion, had stumbled upon these old grievances? Could the parcel in her hand, now hidden in the garden, have contained proof of past wrongs? Miss Marple decided to revisit the Ellington house, ostensibly to admire the garden, now greened by spring rains, but in truth to retrace the movements of those involved. Madame Ellington greeted her with warmth that carried the faintest edge of calculation, as though she understood Miss Marple's visit carried purpose beyond pleasantries. Elsie hovered nearby, quiet and nervous, while Hodge worked in the flower beds, occasionally glancing toward the drawing-room as though unsure how much he could reveal. The garden yielded immediate clues. Miss Marple knelt by the hedge where the parcel had been buried, brushing aside loose soil. There, half hidden, was a small, faded envelope. She did not open it immediately, Prudence dictated careful timing, but it was enough to confirm her suspicions. Clara had indeed unearthed something tangible, and someone had feared its discovery enough to orchestrate her death. It was in the drawing room, as Madame Ellington attended to dusting and rearranging objects with meticulous care, that Miss Marple noticed the first true connection between her suspects. The curtains, tied irregularly, were more than a hiding place. They bore the faint imprint of letters, old and faded. Handling them carefully, she revealed a series of initials, those of Pritchard and Madame Ellington, intertwined. The butler, long thought merely surly and faithful, had once been entrusted with financial documents, correspondence, and secrets of the family. He had been close to the late Mr. Ellington, and perhaps even complicit in past deceptions. Suddenly, the tangled motives gained a historical dimension. Pritchard's resentment and Madame Ellington's caution were not simply matters of the present. They were continuations of old entanglements. Clara, in her diligence and curiosity, had stumbled upon evidence linking past financial improprieties with current positions of power. The parcel, the note, and the staged shattering of porcelain were all components of an intricate plan to ensure those secrets remained hidden. Miss Marple's observations extended to Madame Ellington's expression as she moved about the room. There was something in the widow's eyes, a brief, unguarded flash that revealed a connection to Pritchard, an acknowledgement of shared knowledge, a silent pact born years earlier. They had moved with the ease of two conspirators, performing for the benefit of the household while guarding their true intentions. The recollection of an old scandal now cast the events in a different light. Clara's death was not merely the consequence of her knowledge, it was the resolution of a historical imbalance. The motives of the present were inseparable from the actions of the past. Madame Ellington's careful curation of grief, Pritchard's coerced loyalty, and the nervous compliance of Elsie all stemmed from a shared history that the village had long since forgotten. Miss Marple spent the remainder of the day quietly consolidating her understanding. Every behaviour, every concealment, every contradictory statement made sense when viewed through the prism of history. She recognized that Pritchard's apparent guilt, suggested by the conveniently discovered vial, had been a diversion. Madame Ellington's skill lay in orchestrating appearances, in ensuring that suspicion fell on those who might be conveniently accused, while the true architect of the crime remained beyond reproach in the eyes of casual observers. As evening fell, Miss Marple walked once more through the misted lanes, the weight of the past pressing upon her. Crimes, she knew, were rarely born solely of the present moment. They were the fruit of long-standing grievances, resentments and fears, cultivated over years and nourished by secrecy. In Milburn, the past had cast a long shadow, and Clara Whitchurch had paid the price for seeing through it. Yet the discovery of the hidden connections had clarified one vital point. The threads of history could be followed, traced carefully through behaviour, inconsistencies, and subtle clues. Miss Marple understood that she now possessed the framework upon which the resolution of the case must be built. The motives, once baffling in their present complexity, now aligned into a discernible pattern, and the hidden hand manipulating events, the true criminal, was no longer invisible. The past had illuminated the path, and with patience she would see it through to its conclusion. Miss Marple returned to the Ellington house the following morning, carrying only her knitting and a small leather notebook. She did not announce herself. She needed no audience. Her plan was subtle, a test of observation rather than confrontation, designed to tease out the truth without overt accusation. It was in moments like these she knew that the most revealing cracks in a person's story often appeared, not in words, but in behaviour. The drawing-room was quiet when she entered. Madame Ellington reclined in her usual chair, reading a book whose spine she turned over and over, as if the story itself bored her. Elsie hovered nearby, tidying the room with nervous precision. Hodge had been called to the greenhouse, and the house felt almost empty, the stillness amplifying the faint ticking of the ornate mantel clock. Miss Marple seated herself, arranging her knitting in her lap with deliberate care. She began to speak gently of trivial matters, weather, the village fete, and the roses recently planted in the garden. Her tone was soft, inconsequential, yet Hidden beneath this casual conversation, she had a purpose: to observe reactions, micro-expressions, and slips of attention. She wanted to watch for signs of guilt, anticipation, or anxiety, subtle indicators that might not be caught by more formal questioning. Her eyes rested on Madame Ellington. She began to speak of Clara Whitchurch, not as a victim, but as a clever, cautious young woman who had always kept careful notes and memoranda of household affairs. "She had such a habit of writing things down," Miss Marple said lightly, fingering her knitting. "Little scraps, you know. Even a small note could hold the weight of truth if one were to find it." Madame Ellington's hands trembled slightly, not in grief, but in what Miss Marple identified immediately as alarm, the subtle kind that comes when one realizes a carefully constructed illusion may be at risk. Her gaze flicked to the curtain tie, the corner of the cabinet, the very surfaces Miss Marple had already inspected. Miss Marple paused, letting the quiet grow. Then she asked softly, almost as an aside, "Do you recall, madam, if she ever mentioned unusual hiding places?" Small things, perhaps even hidden among everyday objects. The question, innocuous as it seemed, was a psychological ploy. It invited confession without demanding it. Those who feared exposure often betrayed themselves not by outright lies, but by their reactions, by subtle hesitation, fleeting avoidance, or an involuntary gesture. Madame Ellington's lips parted, then closed again, her fingers tightening around the lace handkerchief. I don't know what you mean," she said, her voice smooth, yet too quick, too precise. Miss Marple inclined her head. Of course," she murmured. "I only thought perhaps she had mentioned a secret, something misplaced. People often do not realize how revealing such remarks can be, even after they are gone." It was then that Miss Marple shifted her focus slightly, moving her gaze toward the tea service on the table. The tray was immaculate, the cups arranged perfectly, yet one cup sat slightly askew, as though hastily replaced. Her eyes flicked to the corner cabinet, to the fragments of porcelain she had noted before. Then, in a voice almost conversational, she asked, "I suppose you remember the sound of that cup breaking, don't you? It must have startled you at the time." Madame Ellington stiffened imperceptibly. Her breath caught for just a moment. Miss Marple leaned slightly forward. "It is curious how memory works. People often remember not the event itself, but their own role in it, their part in the drama. Sometimes the smallest sound leaves the largest impression, especially when one hopes no one notices the truth." For an instant, Madame Ellington's composure faltered. Her gaze darted to the cabinet, then to the curtain folds, as if calculating whether to retrieve or conceal. Miss Marple observed the shift, noting the tiny twitch in her wrist, the involuntary tightening of her fingers. These were the clues that formal procedures overlooked, the subtle cracks in deception. Miss Marple spoke again, more softly this time, almost to herself. "A sound can be staged, a footstep placed deliberately, even a door creaking just so. One would never suspect the arrangement, yet it guides the observer as if by magic." Madame Ellington's hand dropped suddenly to her lap, a small victory of control. Yet the faint quiver in her lips, the imperceptible narrowing of her eyes, told Miss Marple what words could not. The widow knew more than she admitted, and the careful orchestration of events, the stage noise, the porcelain, the buried parcel, was of her design. Miss Marple allowed a pause to stretch, letting silence fill the room like a slowly rising tide. She then added lightly, "I do admire those who take care in arranging things. A certain artistry in the concealment, don't you agree? One must have the patience of a gardener to manage both plants and secrets." Madame Ellington's eyes flickered briefly with something between recognition and fear. Her lips parted, as though to speak, yet she said nothing. The silence was deafening, yet it spoke volumes. The subtle tension, the small physical responses, were the unconventional clue Miss Marple had sought. The widow had betrayed herself without a word. Elsie, meanwhile, remained at her post, unaware of the unspoken test unfolding. Hodge would later remark that he noticed nothing unusual, and that was as it should be. The deception was entirely in Madame Ellington's reactions. Miss Marple's technique, observation through carefully crafted conversation, had bypassed conventional interrogation and forced the guilty party to reveal herself through instinct rather than reason. As Miss Marple rose to take her leave, she did so with quiet satisfaction. She had confirmed her suspicions. The stage noises, the hidden parcel, the porcelain fragments, and the irregular curtain folds were not random. They were the work of Madame Ellington, designed to mislead, to manipulate, and to conceal. The psychological test had worked perfectly. By allowing the widow to believe she controlled the narrative, Miss Marple had drawn out the truth without a single accusation. Walking away through the damp lanes, the wind tugging gently at her shawl, Miss Marple reflected on human nature. Lies, when constructed meticulously, often reveal themselves not through logic or evidence alone, but through the subtle betrayals of instinct, hesitation, a flicker of expression, the twitch of a hand. In this case, it had been enough to show who truly commanded the strings in the Ellington house. And so, the final act approached. Miss Marple now knew that Madame Ellington was not merely grieving or evasive. She was cunning, deliberate, and dangerously capable. The unconventional clue had illuminated the hidden architect of the crime, leaving only the matter of bringing the truth to light. Miss Marple arrived at the Ellington house that morning with a quiet sense of purpose. The previous day's subtle test had confirmed her suspicions about Madame Ellington, yet she knew the path to truth would not be smooth. Deception, once planted, tends to fight to remain buried, and the clever widow would not relinquish her secrets lightly. She made her way first to the drawing-room, ostensibly to admire the late afternoon sun filtering through the lace curtains, but in reality to revisit the curtain folds where she suspected Madame Ellington had hidden something important. Her eyes swept over the cabinet, the mantel, the edge of the carpet where dust sometimes gathered to reveal footprints or shifts in furniture. Everything seemed as she had left it, still carefully arranged, still waiting for the right moment to yield its story. It was Elsie who interrupted her thoughts. The maid arrived breathless, carrying a small tray of tea, her hands trembling as she set it on the table. "Miss Marple, I don't know how to say it," she stammered, eyes wide. The parcel, it's gone." Miss Marple's knitting fell momentarily to her lap. "Gone?" she repeated, steadying herself. "Do you mean you cannot find it?" Elsie nodded, a hand fluttering to her chest. "I placed it under the hedge just as the lady said, to keep it safe. But when I went back, it had vanished. I swear I did not move it." The old detective's mind moved swiftly. The parcel had been the most tangible clue so far. Clara's secret, hidden and preserved, a small thread leading directly to the truth. Its disappearance changed everything. Someone had acted between Clara's burial of it and Elsie's retrieval. The interval had been narrow, the opportunity brief, and yet the thief had managed it, unseen. Miss Marple's gaze travelled over the room, landing on Madame Ellington. The widow sat with a faint, serene expression, her lace handkerchief pressed delicately to her lips. But Miss Marple detected the imperceptible quiver of satisfaction in her eyes. She had orchestrated more than the murder. She had intervened to remove the evidence that might have implicated her. "It seems," Miss Marple said softly, "that someone has been very diligent in keeping secrets safe, or perhaps in keeping certain truths hidden." Madame Ellington's lips curved into a small, controlled smile. "How dreadful, Miss Marple, to think that poor Elsie would misplace something so important." She glanced at the maid, feigning sympathy while simultaneously ensuring her own hand remained close to her side, ready to intervene if necessary. Miss Marple did not reply directly. She turned her attention to the rest of the room, noting small disturbances, the slight indentation in the carpet where a chair had been moved, the faint scuff on the corner of the mantel. The removal of the parcel had been hurried, but not clumsy. Whoever had taken it had done so with the precision of someone intimately familiar with the house, someone who could predict the movement of its occupants and the timing of their returns. Her thoughts returned to the curtain folds, the tie she had previously examined. Madame Ellington had relied on her own knowledge of the household's habits to conceal the parcel and to retrieve it without leaving obvious traces. The removal had been both tactical and preemptive, ensuring that no external observer could easily follow the chain of evidence. Miss Marple decided it was time to question Hodge. The gardener was scrupulous and honest, and though his knowledge of interior affairs was limited, he moved freely about the garden. Perhaps he had seen something unusual. Footsteps, disturbances, the slight gleam of a parcel passing quickly from hedge to hand. Hodge, upon inquiry, admitted seeing a figure moving near the hedge late the previous evening. "I thought it was Elsie," he said, squinting at the memory. "It was dark, and the figure moved quickly. But the way it held its hands, and the light from the lantern on the veranda, well, it seemed deliberate, careful, like someone who knew exactly what they were after." Miss Marple's eyes narrowed. "And you could not see the face?" "No, ma'am. Just the shape, the posture. Quick and quiet. Whoever it was. They knew what they were doing." The details fit together too neatly. Elsie, nervous and honest, had not moved the parcel herself. Hodge had seen a shadow of someone moving deliberately. The thief could only be someone with full access to the house, and someone aware that the investigation was drawing close to a revelation. Miss Marple turned inwardly, reflecting on the implications. The disappearance of the parcel elevated the stakes considerably. Not only had Clara been silenced, but the crucial evidence she had safeguarded was no longer available. The widow's confidence in her own cunning had been reinforced by the theft, while the investigators outside continued to believe Pritchard guilty. Yet Miss Marple understood something else. The removal of evidence, no matter how precise, leaves traces. A pattern emerges in timing, in movement, and in the reactions of those who orchestrate it. Madame Ellington had overestimated her ability to manipulate perception. Subtle errors, the quick glance toward the curtain folds, the imperceptible tightening of fingers around the handkerchief, the brief hesitation before speaking, revealed her involvement to one who knew what to look for. Miss Marple's plan shifted. She could no longer rely on the parcel itself. It had vanished into the careful custody of the criminal. Instead, she would observe, wait, and exploit the widow's confidence. A person who believes themselves secure often lets down their guard, and in such moments the truth can be extracted without violence or force. Elsie, reassured that she had done nothing wrong, helped Miss Marple examine the immediate area of the hedge, but the parcel was gone, as if the earth had swallowed it. Miss Marple made a mental note. The timing, the method, the quick removal all pointed to deliberate foresight. Whoever had orchestrated the theft had anticipated discovery and moved to stay one step ahead. By the late afternoon, the house felt heavier, more tense, as though the walls themselves were aware of the missing parcel and the danger it represented. Madame Ellington moved through her rooms with calculated grace, her demeanour a mask of composure, yet Miss Marple watched every twitch, every hesitation. The game had shifted. No longer was the challenge merely to discern motive or trace hidden connections. Now it was a matter of patience, of timing, and of predicting the actions of a clever adversary who believed herself untouchable. As the day drew to a close, Miss Marple stepped out into the garden once more. The mist had returned, curling around the hedges and flower beds. Somewhere within the walls of the house or beneath the soil of the garden lay the secret that Clara had tried to preserve, and the evidence that might yet reveal the widow's guilt. The vanishing of the parcel had complicated matters, but it had not destroyed the truth. It had merely raised the stakes, sharpened the challenge, and illuminated the skill of the criminal. Miss Marple, serene yet vigilant, knew that the real work had only just begun. In Milburn, the shadows were deep, but patience, observation, and careful deduction could pierce them, and Miss Marple intended to see the truth brought to light, no matter the obstacles or the cleverness of those who sought to hide it. The morning air in Milburn was brisk and sharp, carrying with it a sense of quiet foreboding. Miss Marple had returned to her cottage after a sleepless night, reviewing every detail she had collected. The vanished parcel weighed heavily on her mind, but she felt certain that the clues still existed, hidden, overlooked, yet traceable by patience and observation. Yet as she approached the Ellington house mid-morning, she was met not by calm, but by chaos. A crowd had gathered in the lane outside the house, murmuring anxiously. Constable Harper was in the centre, flustered, gesturing wildly as he spoke to villagers. Miss Marple threaded her way through them, her eyes immediately catching the tension in the butler's posture and the tear-streaked face of Elsie. "What has happened?" she asked softly. Another incident, Miss Marple?" Harper stammered. "It's—" He faltered, then lowered his voice. "Mr. Hodge, the gardener. He's missing. The greenhouse. It's locked from the inside, but the door's ajar, and there's signs of a struggle. No one's seen him since before dawn." Miss Marple felt a chill, but remained composed. Hodge had been careful, honest, and meticulous. If he had vanished or been harmed, it was clear the perpetrator had not only removed evidence, but now sought to eliminate anyone who might piece together the full truth. She moved quickly inside the house. Madame Ellington appeared at the top of the staircase, her expression impeccably calm, though her eyes betrayed a flicker of unease. "Miss Marple, whatever has happened now?" she asked, her voice carefully measured. "The gardener is missing, madam. Please tell me if you know anything," Miss Marple replied evenly, her sharp gaze assessing every minute movement. Madame Ellington's hand hovered over the banister. No, of course not. I heard the commotion, but I was in my room. It is dreadful, of course, but why would anyone wish Mr. Hodge harm? The widow's composure was too perfect, rehearsed. Miss Marple noted the subtle quiver in her lips, the slight tightening of her grip on the banister. These were not signs of grief, but of calculation, the careful self-monitoring of someone who feared exposure. She walked swiftly to the greenhouse, noting the disturbed earth, the trampled plants, and the broken panes of glass that had been hastily repaired. Inside, the air was heavy, musty, and faintly metallic. Hodge was nowhere to be found. There were muddy footprints leading both into the house and toward the back gate, but all were smudged and partial, as though someone had deliberately attempted to confuse tracking. Miss Marple crouched beside the soil, examining the indentations carefully. One set of marks suggested that a body, or at least a heavy bundle, had been dragged. The angle indicated it had been carried toward the house, not the garden. Someone had intended to stage the greenhouse as a point of danger, while moving Hodge elsewhere. The intricacy of the act left no doubt in her mind. The villain was calculating, and several steps ahead. Back in the drawing-room, Elsie trembled as she spoke. I heard noises early this morning, strange thuds like someone moving furniture, and then silence. I didn't dare look." Miss Marple nodded, offering quiet reassurance. "You did exactly right, Elsie. Sometimes silence is the wisest choice, but every sound you heard, every movement tells a story." She then turned her attention to Madame Ellington, who had remained at the top of the stairs, hands folded, posture impeccable. "Madam," Miss Marple said gently, "did anyone besides yourself enter the greenhouse this morning?" The widow's eyes flickered, betraying the first real sign of unease. "No, of course not," she said quickly, but the hesitation, the pause before the word, was enough. Miss Marple noticed the slight shift of her weight, a subtle tension in the shoulders, a reaction that suggested concealment rather than innocence. Her thoughts raced. The stolen parcel, the carefully staged death of Clara Whitchurch, and now the sudden disappearance of Hodge, all pointed to a mind working ahead of every observer, anticipating movements, controlling outcomes. The stakes had shifted dramatically. The crime was no longer merely historical or circumstantial. Someone was actively eliminating threats to their secret, and the longer the investigation proceeded, the more dangerous it became. Miss Marple realized that she herself could be a target. Her previous test, the unconventional conversation, had already exposed Madame Ellington's guilt in subtle ways. Now the villain might seek to remove the detective before the full truth could surface. It was a delicate game. Observation without provocation, preparation without alarm, subtlety without hesitation. She returned to the drawing-room, sitting quietly, knitting in her lap, pretending casual calm. Madame Ellington descended the staircase, smooth and deliberate, each step measured. Miss Marple let her observe without speaking, knowing that the careful widow would overreach in her attempts to assert control. "It is most upsetting," Madame Ellington said finally, as if addressing the room in general. "Whoever has taken Hodge must be found at once. We cannot have such disorder in the household." "Yes," Miss Marple replied softly. "It is unsettling indeed. I hope the authorities will be thorough in their search." The widow's hand twitched toward the mantel, as though to adjust a picture or perhaps retrieve something hidden. It was a small, telling gesture, the type Miss Marple had long learned to watch for. A misstep, a reflex, a hint of panic hidden beneath cultivated composure. Miss Marple's mind worked rapidly. The second incident had confirmed her suspicions. Madame Ellington had not only orchestrated Clara's death and the theft of the parcel, but was actively ensuring that any living witness to the truth was neutralized or manipulated. The investigation had transformed. It was no longer simply a matter of uncovering a past crime. It was now a race to prevent another, to protect those who might reveal the hidden secret, and to anticipate the widow's next calculated move. By afternoon, the village constable had mobilized a search party, yet Miss Marple was already several steps ahead. She reviewed every pathway, every likely hiding place, every potential escape route in her mind. The greenhouse offered clues, the disturbed soil suggesting temporary concealment, perhaps even a hidden cellar or passage. The footprints led back toward the house, but the deliberate smudging indicated care. Someone had moved Hodge without leaving a trail meant to be easily followed. Miss Marple knew that patience and subtle observation would be paramount. Any overt action might trigger the villain to flee or strike again. The next move would require strategy, timing, and an understanding of Madame Ellington's cunning mind. As evening fell and a low mist crept over the garden, Miss Marple stepped outside, her gaze fixed on the greenhouse. Shadows stretched long and deceptive, mingling with the twilight, and she realized that the game had shifted from solving a mystery to preventing a catastrophe. The villain was still several steps ahead, but Miss Marple had learned enough to anticipate her moves. The next hours would be decisive. Lives, including that of Hodge, and perhaps her own, hung in the balance. The unexpected twist had arrived, shaking the case to its core. No longer could she rely solely on the patterns of past grievances or hidden motives. The present demanded vigilance, courage, and a deft touch to prevent further tragedy. And Miss Marple, with her quiet confidence, knew that the shadow of danger was precisely where she could uncover the truth. Miss Marple returned to her cottage that evening, weary but resolute. The morning's shock, the disappearance of Hodge, still weighed heavily on her, yet the fog of confusion began to lift. Often, she reflected, it is not the grandiose gestures or dramatic events that reveal the culprit, but the small, almost trivial details. A misplaced chair, a faint scent, the hesitation in a phrase. It was in these minutiae that truth often lingered, patiently waiting for the attentive eye. She reviewed the series of events in her mind. Clara's sudden death, the stolen parcel, Madame Ellington's carefully measured reactions, Hodge's disappearance, and the subtle inconsistencies in the butler's alibi. One by one, the threads seemed chaotic, tangled, and overwhelming. Yet, as always, Miss Marple trusted that human behaviour has a rhythm, a pattern, even amid deliberate attempts to mask it. Her thoughts returned to the drawing-room, to Madame Ellington herself. It was in the widow's behaviour that Miss Marple had noticed the most telling signs, the tiny quivers in her hands, the brief flickers of panic, the reflexive gestures that betrayed more than words could contain. But there was another thread, less obvious, less deliberate, that had gone unnoticed. The old clock on the mantelpiece, which Madame Ellington habitually wound at the same precise moment each day, her fingers tracing the ornate brass key as though the act itself were ceremonial rather than practical. At first, Miss Marple had dismissed it as mere habit, a widow's meticulous attention to timekeeping. Yet now, with the chaos of recent events, she recognized its significance. The clock's timing coincided with critical movements within the house, the brief period when Elsie had been sent to the pantry, when the parcel had vanished, when the sounds of the stage porcelain had echoed through the drawing-room. Each act occurred in that small window, unnoticed by others but synchronized perfectly with Madame Ellington's routine. The realization struck her. The widow's most mundane habits had provided her with opportunities to manipulate events without drawing suspicion. The pattern was not in dramatic gestures, but in the subtle orchestration of ordinary actions, a flick of the wrist, the adjustment of a curtain, the careful placement of objects, all timed to avoid scrutiny. Miss Marple made her way back to the Ellington house the following morning, her mind alert for further confirmations. Madame Ellington received her as usual, cordial and composed, though a faint shadow of unease flickered across her features when the detective entered. Elsie and Hodge, now found slightly shaken but unharmed, assured her that all was calm, yet Miss Marple observed the tension lingering in their movements. The pattern of control remained intact, though its threads were now more visible to her careful eyes. She began by examining the drawing room again, noting the positions of objects, the folds of the curtains, and the alignment of the chairs. Something small and seemingly insignificant caught her attention, a slip of paper protruding slightly from the back of a book on Madame Ellington's side table. It was the kind of detail one would easily overlook, neither dramatic nor threatening, but to Miss Marple it was a potential key. Retrieving the paper discreetly, she found a brief note penned in a neat, deliberate hand. It contained a list of times and locations within the house, each corresponding to movements she had observed over the past week. The handwriting was unmistakably Madame Ellington's. The note revealed a schedule, a careful orchestration of events designed to ensure that no witness could observe her actions, while still maintaining the appearance of ordinary household routine. The parcel, the stage porcelain, the manipulations of Elsie and Hodge, they all fit within this meticulous timetable. Miss Marple smiled faintly. The clue had been in plain sight all along, hidden not in dramatic gestures but in the widow's obsessive adherence to habit. Where others saw only routine, she had concealed a labyrinth of deceit. The seemingly innocuous moments, the winding of a clock, the adjustment of a cushion, the timing of a servant's errands, formed a pattern that, when recognized, mapped the entire series of crimes. To confirm her suspicion, she observed Madame Ellington's behavior with renewed focus. At the precise moment indicated by the note, the widow moved to straighten a curtain fold, adjusted a decorative vase, and glanced toward the corner of the room where the parcel had been found. Each motion was deliberate, precise, and unmistakably rehearsed. The pattern was no longer subtle. It had emerged in full clarity. Miss Marple's thoughts extended to Hodge. The gardener's disappearance had initially seemed alarming, yet now it made sense within the emerging framework. He had been moved to prevent discovery, to maintain the illusion of security, all according to the widow's carefully timed orchestration. Even the constable's premature conclusion about Pritchard's guilt had been anticipated, a minor misdirection designed to reinforce the narrative that the household's troubles were external rather than internal. She also reconsidered the behavior of the maid, Elsie. The nervous glances, the hesitations, the moments of compliance, all were responses to the pattern rather than the crime itself. Madame Ellington had constructed a web so finely tuned that even the most attentive observer could be led to misinterpret the movements of her household. Only by recognizing the underlying schedule and the precise alignment of routine could the truth be discerned. By afternoon, Miss Marple had assembled a clear mental map. The theft of the parcel, the orchestration of Clara's death, the disappearance of Hodge, the manipulation of servants, and the staging of minor accidents all fit within a sequence of events that revealed the widow's cunning and premeditation. The pattern was undeniable. Every act was interconnected, each small gesture supporting the larger design. Walking through the garden, Miss Marple allowed herself a moment of reflection. The pattern, once elusive, now provided clarity. The villain's methods were no longer mysterious. They were a calculated dance, carefully choreographed to mislead, intimidate, and conceal. Understanding the rhythm of this dance allowed her to anticipate future moves, to predict actions, and to prepare the steps necessary to bring the truth into light. By evening, she returned to her cottage, her mind alive with strategy. The seemingly innocuous details, the winding of a clock, the slip of paper, the precise timing of movements, had illuminated the hidden structure of the crimes. Madame Ellington's deception, once a blur of chaos, was now a discernible sequence. The puzzle pieces, once scattered and confusing, had finally begun to align. Miss Marple realized that the key to resolution lay not in dramatic confrontation, but in the patient, careful use of the pattern she had uncovered. The seemingly minor details, the unnoticed gestures, the habitual actions of the household, these were the very threads that would unravel the widow's web. In plain sight, yet hidden by their ordinariness, the pattern had emerged, and with it, the path to justice. Miss Marple sat quietly in the drawing-room of the Ellington house, the late afternoon sunlight falling in muted shafts across the polished floorboards. She had spent the better part of the day retracing movements, observing gestures and rereading the slips of paper she had found tucked behind the books. The emerging pattern had made one thing clear. Madame Ellington was meticulous, calculating, and patient beyond reason. But understanding her methods was only part of the solution. The deeper question, the why, remained. Miss Marple reflected on the details: the stolen parcel, Clara's death, the disappearance of Hodge, the manipulation of servants, and the staged incidents that had misled the authorities. Each act was carefully choreographed, yet the reason behind such extreme measures had not been apparent. At first glance, greed, social standing, or fear of scandal seemed plausible, but something in Madame Ellington's behaviour suggested a more profound motive, one that went beyond ordinary human ambition. Her attention returned to Madame Ellington herself. The widow sat primly in her chair, reading a book with delicate fingers brushing its pages. Her face was composed, her posture perfect, but Miss Marple's keen eyes detected subtle signs of obsession: the slight tightening of the jaw, the rhythmic tapping of her fingers on the armrest, the way her gaze repeatedly flicked toward the corner where the parcel had been hidden. These were not the behaviours of someone motivated solely by material gain or social reputation. They spoke of a deeper psychological drive. Miss Marple recalled the earliest reports she had received from neighbours. Whispers about Madame Ellington's meticulousness, her insistence on order, her near-pathological attention to detail. It had seemed eccentric at first, perhaps even charmingly fastidious. Yet now, within the context of the crimes, these traits suggested a compulsion, a need to control every aspect of her environment, to orchestrate events according to her exact design. Then a small, almost trivial remark Elsie had made during the earlier questioning resurfaced in Miss Marple's mind. The maid had mentioned that Madame Ellington often spoke of preserving the house as it should be, that things must not be disturbed, and that some truths are too dangerous to remain visible. At the time, Miss Marple had noted it lightly. Now it seemed profoundly revealing. Madame Ellington's actions were not merely practical, they were protective in a distorted, obsessive sense. The crimes were about maintaining an illusion, preserving a controlled narrative, and eliminating anything that might disrupt the carefully constructed order of her life. Miss Marple looked around the room again, considering the connections between the deceased, the missing, and the witnesses. Clara Whitchurch had been diligent, clever, and observant, qualities that posed a threat to Madame Ellington's constructed reality. Hodge had inadvertently seen too much, and the stolen parcel had represented a tangible record of truths that the widow could not allow to surface. Each act of violence or concealment was a response not to greed or revenge, but to a compulsion to preserve control, to maintain a fragile equilibrium in which Madame Ellington's perception of order remained unchallenged. The realization struck Miss Marple with the clarity of a bell. This was not a crime motivated by typical human desires. It was the manifestation of a psychological fixation, a dangerous obsession with dominance over reality itself. Madame Ellington's meticulousness, her timing, her manipulations, and her willingness to commit murder were all driven by an extreme need for control. To her, the truth itself was a threat, a variable that must be managed, hidden, or destroyed to preserve the world as she believed it should be. To confirm her suspicions, Miss Marple arranged a careful conversation with the widow, ostensibly about trivial matters: the arrangements of flowers, the alignment of books, the care of the garden. She watched intently as Madame Ellington responded, noting every hesitation, every adjustment of posture, every subtle twitch. Then, with deliberate casualness, Miss Marple mentioned the parcel, framing it as a minor curiosity rather than a critical clue. The effect was immediate. Madame Ellington's composure faltered for the briefest instant. Her hand moved instinctively toward the cabinet, her eyes darting to the corner of the room where the parcel had once rested. The small, involuntary gesture spoke volumes. It revealed the deep psychological impulse driving her actions. The parcel, a mere collection of papers and notes, represented the potential disruption of the order she so fiercely maintained. To Madame Ellington, it was not the physical object, but the threat to her perceived control that mattered most. Miss Marple continued gently, drawing her observations into conversation. "It must be terribly unsettling," she said, when something you have worked so carefully to arrange threatens to unravel, even in the smallest way. One can see how a person might feel compelled to intervene. Madame Ellington's lips pressed together. She nodded slightly, almost imperceptibly, as if conceding a silent truth to the detective's words without admitting it aloud. There was no boast, no denial, only the quiet acknowledgement that the actions she had taken were a response to a perceived imbalance in her meticulously managed world. The detective considered the implications. The true danger of Madame Ellington's behaviour lay not in greed or revenge, which could be anticipated or bargained with, but in obsession. Obsessive individuals are not guided by reason alone. They respond to threats, real or imagined, to their carefully constructed systems. This explained the extremity of her actions. Murder, manipulation, theft, and intimidation were all defensive measures, not attacks of opportunity. Each step had been taken to preserve the fragile reality she had built around herself. Miss Marple reflected further on the web of deception. Pritchard had been used as a convenient scapegoat. Elsie manipulated, Hodge threatened. Every element of the household's apparent disorder was orchestrated to protect the internal narrative, to keep the outer world from encroaching upon Madame Ellington's perception of order. It was a pattern that was chilling in its thoroughness, brilliant in its logic, and terrifying in its moral consequences. By evening, the detective had synthesized a full understanding. The psychological motive, Madame Ellington's obsessive need for control, explained every previous anomaly, every deception, every small misstep in the chain of events. It clarified why she had committed murder, why she had stolen and hidden evidence, and why she had meticulously manipulated those around her. The motive was not merely practical or material. It was existential, rooted in a profound fear that the world might fail to conform to her precise expectations. Miss Marple, serene and composed, recognized the final challenge, to confront this motive without provoking further violence, to expose the truth while navigating the dangerous terrain of obsession. Understanding the mind behind the crimes was essential not only for justice, but for preventing additional harm. The revelation of the hidden motive, the widow's psychological compulsion, had illuminated the case fully. Now, the task remained to bring that understanding to bear, to untangle the final threads, and to ensure that the consequences of obsession could no longer threaten the lives of the innocent. Miss Marple returned to the Ellington house just as dusk began to cast long, soft shadows across the garden. The day had been spent reviewing her observations, confirming the emerging pattern, and contemplating Madame Ellington's deep-seated need for control. Now, she knew that the time had come for the final confrontation. She had all the pieces in place: the stolen parcel, the slips of paper detailing movements, the sequence of misdirections, and, most importantly, the psychological profile of the widow herself. Entering the drawing-room, she found Madame Ellington seated in her usual chair, the air calm yet tense, as if the house itself anticipated the coming storm. Elsie hovered in the corner, ostensibly tending to the tea, though her nervous glances betrayed her awareness that something was about to unfold. Miss Marple arranged her knitting neatly in her lap, an image of serene composure belying the sharpness of her mind. "Madame Ellington," she began, her voice soft, almost conversational, "I hope you don't mind if I ask a few questions about our recent incidents." The widow's eyes, previously so composed, flickered ever so slightly. She inclined her head, lips pressed together in the faintest line of suspicion. "Of course, Miss Marple. I shall answer as best I can, though I am certain everything will be clarified soon." Miss Marple's hands moved slowly as if adjusting her knitting, but her mind was focused entirely on the widow's reactions. "You must understand," she said gently. "I have observed much over the past week. Small details, seemingly trivial habits, yet they often tell the true story when words do not." Madame Ellington's hand trembled just slightly as she set her book aside. I am careful, yes, but who could blame me? These are unsettling events. I've done nothing wrong, Miss Marple. Surely you understand that?" Miss Marple nodded slowly. "I do, madame. Yet one cannot help but notice the careful timing of certain actions, the precise moments when doors are opened, objects are moved, or people are directed elsewhere. It is a remarkable orchestration, almost as though someone wishes to conceal the truth while maintaining an air of perfect order. The widow's composure wavered for the first time. Her hands clutched the armrests, knuckles whitening. I do not understand what you mean," she said, her voice slightly higher in pitch than usual. Miss Marple leaned forward ever so slightly, her eyes calm but unyielding. "The parcel, madame. The one buried under the hedge. Its disappearance, and the carefully staged sequence surrounding it, along with other events in the household. They are all connected, as you must realize." Madame Ellington's lips parted in a faint gasp, then pressed together again. Her eyes darted toward the corner cabinet, then to the mantel as if calculating her next move. Miss Marple waited, patiently, knowing that a person driven by obsession would act instinctively when cornered. "You believe," the widow said finally, her voice low, almost a whisper, "that I orchestrated these events? That I am responsible for everything?" Miss Marple nodded, her calm demeanour unshaken. "Indeed, madam. The pattern is clear. The timing of your actions, the manipulation of servants, the handling of evidence, it all points to you. The motive is also clear. This is not merely about wealth, reputation, or petty revenge. It is about control, about maintaining the world as you believe it should be." Madame Ellington's eyes widened, the mask of civility cracking. You do not understand. It was necessary. All of it. If the truth, if the chaos had emerged, everything would have collapsed. The house, the household, our lives. Miss Marple remained seated, calm and deliberate. "I understand, madame, more than you realize, but the truth cannot be hidden indefinitely. Actions, even the most carefully calculated, leave traces, and when patterns emerge, the deception becomes visible." The widow rose abruptly, her movement sharp, almost desperate. "You cannot expose me. I cannot allow it. You do not understand the consequences." She advanced toward the mantel, reaching for a small object. Miss Marple noted instantly that it was the missing parcel, hidden in a secret compartment she had not anticipated the detective discovering. Miss Marple's voice was gentle but firm. "Madame Ellington, there is no need for further action. You have been observed, your pattern understood. Surrendering the truth is far safer than attempting to destroy it again. There is still time to act with dignity." The widow froze, the parcel clutched in her hands. For a heartbeat, the room was silent except for the faint ticking of the clock. Then her shoulders sagged, and the intense fire of obsession in her eyes dimmed into something softer, resignation, fear, and a grudging acknowledgement of defeat. I cannot lose control," she whispered, tears forming at the corners of her eyes. "Everything, all the order, must be preserved." Miss Marple leaned forward, her knitting forgotten, speaking with quiet authority. "Madam, the order you fear losing exists only in your mind. The real world is far more forgiving if you do not try to shape it through extreme measures. The truth, properly revealed, can restore balance rather than destroy it." The widow's hands trembled as she released the parcel onto the mantel. It slid across the polished wood, its contents now exposed. Miss Marple's eyes scanned the papers quickly, confirming the final pieces of evidence. Clara's meticulous notes, Hodge's observations, and the careful records of Madame Ellington's actions. Everything was accounted for. Madame Ellington sank back into her chair, exhausted, defeated. I thought I could manage it all. I thought I could protect everything. But it became too much." Miss Marple nodded, her expression gentle. "Yes, madame. But now, with the truth revealed, the consequences will be fair, measured, and inevitable. You need not act further. Justice will follow, but the danger is over. No one will be harmed again if we allow the process to unfold properly." The widow's shoulders shook with the first genuine emotion Miss Marple had seen. Grief, not for her own loss, but for the fragile control she had clung to so desperately. Elsie hovered near the doorway, unsure whether to approach or retreat, and Miss Marple signalled softly for calm. The atmosphere, once taut with tension, relaxed into an uneasy but necessary quiet. With the final confrontation complete, the pieces of the puzzle were aligned. The pattern of behaviour, the stolen parcel, the manipulated household, and the obsessive motive were all revealed and confirmed. Madame Ellington's desperate acts had been laid bare, not through force or accusation, but through careful observation, strategic pressure, and the patient unveiling of her own compulsions. As the evening shadows lengthened, Miss Marple stood and gathered her belongings. "The situation is now clear," she said quietly, "and the truth, though painful, is no longer hidden. Madame Ellington, it is time to allow the proper authorities to take over. You have acted within the bounds of your own impulses, but the consequences must follow." The widow nodded weakly, her composure entirely dissolved. The room was silent, but for the soft ticking of the mantel clock, each beat marking the end of one chapter and the beginning of the resolution. Miss Marple, serene as ever, knew that the trap had worked perfectly. The pattern had been uncovered, the motive revealed, and the final confrontation had brought the truth to light without further harm. The long, meticulous journey of observation, deduction, and psychological insight had culminated in this moment. The house, once a stage for carefully orchestrated deception, now rested in the calm certainty of revealed truth. Miss Marple, quietly composed, prepared to leave, satisfied that justice, in its patient and deliberate way, had been served. Miss Marple had barely stepped out of the Ellington house when a sudden ringing from the village post office drew her attention. A letter had arrived, hand-delivered and marked urgent. The courier, breathless and slightly flustered, handed it to her with no explanation, and she noticed immediately that the handwriting was not Madame Ellington's. Curious, she unfolded the note carefully, sensing that its timing was anything but coincidental. The letter was brief, cryptic, and unnerving. "You have uncovered part of the truth, Miss Marple, but you have not seen the full picture. Those you trust may conceal more than Madame Ellington ever did. Beware the shadows that linger behind loyalty." Miss Marple's brow furrowed. The neat, deliberate script suggested someone with a calm but calculating mind, someone who understood the investigation intimately. This was not the random act of a frightened witness or a meddling village resident. Whoever had written this was confident that they could manipulate events, and the wording implied far-reaching knowledge. A sudden thought struck her. The seemingly loyal servants, Elsie, Pritchard, and even Hodge, had all been placed carefully in her observations. Their hesitations, their nervous glances, their small inconsistencies, she had noted them, but now she wondered if she had overlooked something more sinister. Someone had been deliberately hiding in plain sight, allowing Madame Ellington to serve as a convenient scapegoat for their own machinations. Her mind raced back through the events of the past week. The stolen parcel, the staged death, the disappearance of Hodge, all had pointed clearly to Madame Ellington's obsession-driven actions, yet the letter suggested that the true control of events might not have rested solely with her. Who could have had access to the information necessary to manipulate the household so completely? Who had orchestrated the timing, ensured that the pattern she had uncovered would seem so coherent, and then allowed Madame Ellington's compulsions to do much of the work for them? Miss Marple returned to the Ellington house immediately, though she did so with quiet subtlety, careful not to alert anyone to her renewed concern. The drawing-room was empty, save for the widow, who had remained secluded after the confrontation. Madame Ellington looked up as Miss Marple entered, a mixture of apprehension and resignation on her face. "I received this letter," Miss Marple said softly, placing it on the table. "It claims there is more to the story than we have uncovered. Do you know anything about it?" Madame Ellington's eyes flickered with genuine surprise, though she quickly composed herself. I cannot imagine. I've heard nothing. If it is a threat, it must be addressed by the authorities. I've done nothing beyond what you have already discovered." Miss Marple nodded, but her mind was already racing. She asked a few innocuous questions, watching the widow closely for any subtle reactions. Then, almost casually, she suggested a review of the household records, books, and correspondence. Madame Ellington allowed her to inspect freely, confident that all evidence had been accounted for. Yet Miss Marple's sharp eye noticed something overlooked, a small, thin ledger tucked behind the more prominent account books. It was clean, precise, and filled with neat entries that at first glance appeared financial, but a careful review revealed far more: coded notations, initials, and timestamps corresponding exactly with the movements and actions Miss Marple had attributed solely to Madame Ellington. The realization hit her with the clarity of lightning. Someone had been controlling the household, alongside, or perhaps above, Madame Ellington. The meticulous timing of events, the disappearance of evidence, and the careful manipulations had not been the widow's work alone. The ledger contained patterns that suggested strategic interference, interventions that had guided the obsessive actions of Madame Ellington towards certain outcomes, ensuring that specific mistakes were made or certain items remained hidden. Miss Marple considered the staff: Elsie, the maid, whose nervous glances and hesitations now appeared rehearsed; Pritchard, whose alibi had seemed overly convenient; and Hodge, whose disappearance had been staged with unnerving precision. The ledger indicated that each had been in communication, either directly or through subtle signals, with an unseen orchestrator who had ensured Madame Ellington's actions aligned with a larger plan. Her gaze shifted to the maid, Elsie, who had entered the room quietly, bringing tea. The young woman's hands trembled, and her eyes darted nervously between Miss Marple and the ledger. Miss Marple's intuition told her that Elsie had been more than an observer. She had been an instrument, carefully positioned to direct the widow without her full awareness. "Elsie," Miss Marple said softly, "I wonder if you might help me understand the ledger I've just discovered. Perhaps you can explain some of these entries." Elsie froze. For a heartbeat the room was heavy with tension, the quiet ticking of the mantel clock echoing ominously. Then her lips parted in a whisper, as if confiding in someone who had long understood what she could not admit aloud. I did what I was told," she murmured. "I only followed instructions. I did not know the full plan. Only the signals, the signs." Miss Marple leaned closer, her voice gentle but unyielding. "And who gave these instructions, Elsie? Who orchestrated everything so carefully?" The maid's eyes filled with tears, her hands trembling over the handle of the teapot. It was Mr. Pritchard. He had been watching everything for weeks, guiding Madame Ellington, ensuring she would act as needed. I only delivered messages, shifted objects, gave signals. He told me it was for the safety of the house. Miss Marple's sharp mind catalogued the revelation. Pritchard, the trusted butler, the unassuming, dutiful servant, had been the true mastermind behind the chaos. Madame Ellington had acted obsessively, but under Pritchard's subtle guidance. He had used her compulsions, her need for control, as a mechanism to execute his own ends. The thefts, the manipulations, the threats, all had been orchestrated to remove obstacles, mislead investigators, and control the outcome while he remained hidden in plain sight. The final, last-minute twist struck with staggering force. The seemingly resolved case, the exposure of Madame Ellington's obsessive crimes, was incomplete. The true villain, Pritchard, had carefully concealed himself, manipulating others to carry out his objectives while maintaining his own appearance of loyalty. His intelligence, foresight, and understanding of human psychology had allowed him to operate undetected, leaving only minor clues that a mind like Miss Marple's could discern. The detective's genius was tested once more. To fully resolve the case, she would need to confront Pritchard, unravel his schemes, and reveal his hidden control over the household. The calm, quiet village of Milburn, once the stage for a seemingly simple domestic crime, now faced the revelation of a cunning and deliberate manipulator whose reach extended far beyond initial appearances. Miss Marple allowed herself a faint smile, the smallest spark of triumph. The puzzle had shifted, but the rules remained the same: observation, patience, and a clear understanding of human nature. With the final twist unveiled, she prepared to follow the trail to its ultimate conclusion, knowing that only by confronting the true orchestrator could justice be fully served. Miss Marple arrived at the Ellington house early the next morning, the autumn sun casting a pale light across the dew-laden garden. Though the air was crisp, the tension she carried was warmer, heavier, a silent weight that seemed to press against the walls themselves. After the revelations of the previous evening, She knew that the resolution of the case required careful deliberation and precise timing. The true villain, Pritchard, remained at large, and though his manipulations had been exposed, the final confrontation would demand patience, subtlety, and an unwavering calm. Inside, Madame Ellington sat in her chair, hands folded, her eyes hollow with the exhaustion of obsessive vigilance and the shock of betrayal. The widow had already confessed her obsessive actions under Miss Marple's patient questioning, but her confession, while true, was incomplete. It only accounted for her compulsion-driven crimes, not the deliberate orchestration that had guided them. Miss Marple's mind turned to the ledger, the coded entries, and the signals that Elsie had followed. The pattern of control, once attributed solely to the widow, now revealed the extent of Pritchard's influence. Miss Marple began by explaining the chain of events, speaking gently, methodically, so that Madame Ellington could comprehend the full consequences. "You see, Madame, your actions, while extreme, were not entirely your own design. Someone has been using your compulsions to shape events according to their own plan. Your meticulous nature made you the perfect instrument for this orchestration." The widow's lips trembled as she nodded slowly. I was blind to it," she whispered. "I believed I was protecting everything." "Indeed," Miss Marple said, her voice calm and deliberate. "And that belief, while understandable, was used against you. The ledger, the coded entries, the signals delivered to you and others, they all point to Pritchard. He guided your actions, ensuring that each move would benefit him while maintaining his own innocence in the eyes of others." Madame Ellington's eyes widened as the final pieces clicked into place. "But he seemed so loyal. I trusted him. I believed he cared for the household." "Precisely," Miss Marple replied. "Loyalty, when feigned, is the most powerful tool for manipulation. Pritchard understood that by presenting himself as trustworthy, he could direct events, conceal evidence, and control outcomes while remaining invisible. The minor misdirections, the stage distractions, and the carefully timed absences, these were all orchestrated to ensure your compulsions acted in ways he desired." Elsie, standing silently nearby, shivered as the explanation unfolded. The young maid had been caught in the web, used as a messenger, a mover of objects, a subtle signaller of tasks. Miss Marple addressed her next, her voice gentle. "And you, Elsie, acted without full knowledge, yet your compliance was key. But now your observations help illuminate the truth. The ledger, your recollections, and the timing of events all reveal Pritchard's central role." The widow slumped back in her chair, tears streaming. I never wanted anyone to be harmed. I only wished to maintain order." "And that desire," Miss Marple said softly, "was the reason you were so easily manipulated. Your compulsion, while understandable, became the instrument of Pritchard's plan. It is an important lesson. Even the most seemingly harmless fixation can be exploited by one with cunning intent." Having laid bare the full structure of deception, Miss Marple turned her attention to Pritchard's probable next move. The butler was clever, calculating, and aware that his influence was now partially exposed. Yet Miss Marple had deduced that he would underestimate her resolve and capacity to anticipate his actions. She instructed Madame Ellington to remain calm, emphasizing that the authorities would arrive soon, but that no action should provoke the fugitive into further mischief. Miss Marple then outlined the clues that others had missed. Small discrepancies, subtle patterns, and overlooked signals. She spoke of the ledger entries, the faint scratches on the underside of the writing desk, the timing of the parcel's placement, and Elsie's nervous glances, all details that revealed Pritchard's orchestration. By following these, she had reconstructed his manipulations with certainty. Yet, as she explained, a shadow of unease remained. Pritchard's intelligence and foresight meant that while his schemes were now exposed, his next step might be escape. Miss Marple had anticipated this possibility. She had already discreetly informed the local constables, ensured that key exits from the village were monitored, and left subtle misleading signs suggesting that Madame Ellington would be alone at certain times, a trap designed to tempt the cunning but ultimately corner him. Hours passed with deliberate tension. Madame Ellington remained seated, the household quiet but alert. Miss Marple walked the garden path, observing the surroundings, noting every detail. The postman's footsteps, the rustling of leaves, the distant echo of a horse's hooves. Each detail was part of a living map she had drawn in her mind, predicting the potential movements of a mastermind like Pritchard. Finally, a shadow appeared at the far edge of the property, a figure moving cautiously toward the house. Miss Marple's keen eye identified him instantly. Pritchard, attempting what he believed would be a final surreptitious intervention. Calmly, she signalled to the waiting constables, who emerged from their concealment to intercept him. Pritchard froze, caught off guard by the speed and precision of the authorities. He attempted a last, desperate retreat toward the trees, but the net had been drawn tightly. Miss Marple stepped forward, her gaze steady. "It is over, Mr. Pritchard," she said quietly. "The pattern is complete, the manipulations exposed. There is no further escape." The butler's expression shifted from defiance to disbelief, then to reluctant acknowledgement. The web he had spun, intricate and cunning, had been unravelled not through force but through careful observation, insight into human behaviour, and the patient assembling of subtle details. Every overlooked clue, every minor hesitation, every habitual gesture had led to this moment. As Pritchard was led away, the household exhaled collectively. Madame Ellington's hands shook, but she remained seated, no longer consumed by the need for absolute control. Elsie wept softly, a mixture of relief and lingering guilt passing over her features. Miss Marple allowed a small smile, satisfied not merely with the capture of the criminal, but with the restoration of clarity and order to lives disrupted by obsession and cunning manipulation. Before leaving, Miss Marple addressed the household one last time. "Remember," she said gently, "it is not only grand gestures that conceal the truth, but the small, ordinary acts that seem trivial. Observation, patience, and understanding of human nature are the tools that reveal deception. Today, justice has been served, but let it also serve as a lesson for the future." As she stepped into the crisp evening air, Miss Marple felt a familiar sense of completion, yet the faint shadow of unease lingered. Even when justice is delivered, one must never forget the fragile, complex human behaviours that allowed such deception to flourish. Pritchard was in custody, Madame Ellington's compulsions were revealed, and the household could begin to heal. But the story, with its hidden intricacies and lessons in human psychology, would remain a reminder that even the seemingly open and shut cases may conceal surprises for those not keen enough to observe. The train to Paddington puffed away, into the soft gold of the late afternoon, leaving behind the village of Windermere in its fading wake. On the platform stood Miss Marple, wrapped in her familiar pale blue shawl, her eyes not on the departing engine, but on the faint reflection in the glass of the waiting-room, a face serene and composed, but still puzzled. Her and Madame Ellington's drawing-room was now quiet, its silks and satins folded away, its perfumes lingering only faintly in the air. The newspapers would report her death as natural, following a minor fall down the stairs. No foul play, no scandal, just a widow alone in a too-grand house. The real truth, known only to a select few, would never reach the breakfast tables of England. Miss Marple had uncovered it, of course. The hidden passage behind the wine cellar, the misplaced brooch that had slipped from Madame Ellington's dressing gown at a time she was supposedly bedridden, the half-burned letter to a Mr. J.P. Trevelyan that the housekeeper had attempted to destroy. Lies built on secrets, all untangled with the same patient fingers that knit baby booties and mended parish banners. Still, something itched at the back of her mind. She had been walking down the gravel path that led from the Ellington estate, cane tapping gently with each step, when the thought crystallized. That final letter. Not the one Madame had tried to burn, but the one she had left. Folded neatly on the escritoire, addressed not to family nor solicitor, but to a reader of shadows. At the time she'd taken it for eccentricity, theatrical. Madame Ellington had always been a performer after all, the once-renowned Parisian stage actress who married Sir Thomas Ellington and promptly disappeared into a Sussex manor. She'd never taken to English domesticity, but she'd made a fine portrait of it, or so it had seemed. Miss Marple stopped walking. The sun filtered through the yew trees beside the lane, casting sharp needles of shade across the gravel. Slowly she reached into her handbag and withdrew the small envelope she'd taken before the constables arrived. She had not opened it. Respect for the dead, she'd told herself. But really, she'd been waiting to see if the mystery truly was over. She slit the seal with a hairpin and read, "To the one who sees what others cannot, the play is over, but the stage remains. What you've uncovered is not the ending, but the prologue. Seek the rosewood box behind the fireplace mantel. The key is in the ivory comb. Be wary of the names you think you know, for mine was never Ellington. May you find the truth in silence, not applause. L." Miss Marple read it twice, lips thinning. The ivory comb had been in the dressing table, a relic of vanity from Madame's younger days. No one had thought it remarkable, and no one had examined the fireplace beyond a cursory glance. It had not been lit in months. Turning on her heel with surprising agility, Miss Marple made her way back up the Lane Winmere was quiet, its hedgerows trimmed, its windows reflecting sunlight. But Winmere also housed secrets, like all English villages, neatly buttoned under cardigans and tea cosies. She reached the Ellington estate in 20 minutes. Constables were gone, the doors locked, but her shawl concealed a skeleton key, courtesy of old Mr. Carpenter, the locksmith, who once boasted of making keys that could open any manor in Sussex for the right lady. Inside, dust already claimed the corners. The house was still. The scent of Madame's jasmine oil clung to the banister as Miss Marple climbed the stairs. She went first to the dressing table. The ivory comb was there, delicate and yellowed with age. Sliding her fingers along its spine, she found the tiny hinge, almost imperceptible. Within was a sliver-thin brass key. Back downstairs, Miss Marple approached the drawing-room's grand fireplace. It took time. Her hands were not as strong as they once were, but eventually she shifted the heavy iron grate and felt behind the wooden mantel. Her fingers touched a notch, then cool wood. The rosewood box was small and unmarked, save for a faint carving of 2 interlocking swans. The lock turned easily. Inside were documents, birth certificates, letters, passports, but none bore the name Ellington. Instead, Lisette Valois, Claudia Mersey, Eleanor Roth, all the same face in the faded photographs. One woman, many names. And then the photograph. A young girl, maybe 5, clutching a stuffed rabbit, with Madame Lisette smiling behind her. On the back, Margot, 1932. The only thing I ever got right. There had been no mention of a child in Madame's records. No birth, no adoption. Nothing. Miss Marple sat back on her heels, staring at the box. So much made sense now. The disappearances, the false trails, the sudden departure from the stage, the marriage of convenience to Sir Thomas. But the girl, Margot, where was she now? Another letter lay folded at the bottom of the box. This one addressed not to a reader, but to my darling M. My dearest child, if you are reading this, then it is too late for me. You have spent your life in shadows because I made it so. I had to disappear. For your sake. They were looking for us both after the affair in Vienna. I did what I had to, and I would do it again. You may hate me for it, but know this. I loved you more than the stage, more than England, more than life. Your mother, always. Madame. A breath passed through the room, soft as silk. Outside, the crows began to call. Miss Marple closed the box, slowly. There would be no police inquiry into this. The child, now likely a woman of 50, may never come forward. But someone would need to know. Someone would be watching, now that the box was uncovered. On the mantel, the clock struck 5. Miss Marple rose, smoothing her skirt. Somewhere in London, perhaps, a woman walked through her life unaware of her mother's final act of protection. Or, perhaps not unaware, perhaps she had always known. Miss Marple left the house, locking the door behind her. As she reached the gate, a man passed her on the road. Tweed coat, bowler hat, briefcase in hand. He tipped his hat politely. "Afternoon, madam." "Good afternoon," she replied, eyes narrowing slightly. He passed without pause, but Miss Marple noted the scuff on his shoes, the fading ink on his cuff, and the glint of a foreign coin on his watch chain. She continued walking, the rosewood box tucked into her bag. The mystery of Madame Ellington had ended, but shadows stretched long in August, and in those shadows a new curtain stirred.